Hi Tim, want to give you a little bit of feedback on your in your presentation file. Sorry about the delay. Things have been a little chaotic around here. A lot of people looking for assistance at the end of the week. Um, so I'll go through the slides. I've got your script here in a separate file, I guess, and I can try to look at them and see what I think you need to add. I mean, the title slide looks fine. By the way, if you want, I think you can put all of your notes. Looks like you started to do some of this. You can put your notes directly on your slides. Looks like you kind of are doing that in the presenter tools. You'll have access to those, and I think that's a good way to include some information. So, yeah, I mean, background on fish advice. So one thing I will point out right off the top of my head that you might want to consider, and as you're finalizing your presentation, I often think that using a banner or using some consistent feature on each slide is a good way to lead your audience through the presentation. It kind of provides a roadmap. So, the basic features of a presentation, you have your introduction, so that's your background and context, or introduction, whatever you want to call it. You have your research question. You have your internship and methods, sometimes as one slide, sometimes as multiple slides separated. Then you have your results, which might be multiple slides of results, and then you have usually a significance or implication section. And I think that it's a good idea to include either a banner or a consistent aspect of the title that ties together these various components. So for instance, here, where you're talking about background, you might say introduction, fish advisories. And then when you go to the next slide, it would be introduction, colon, bioaccumulation. Right? Those are ideas. The other idea is to use like a banner, a running banner across the top. So you might have introduction, question, internship and methods, results, and significance. And it essentially shows your audience visually where they are in your presentation. I'm sure you've seen that approach used before. So just keep that in mind, that I think for instance, having your titles in the same location is helpful. Sometimes it bounces around, but same location, same size, and then having some sort of feature of the title that unifies the sections. So in some cases, it'll be introduction, colon, fish advisories, introduction, colon, bioaccumulation. This would be introduction, colon, Region 10 site-related advisories, or something like that. The other thing I would say about the titles that you might want to consider is making sure that they are all the same consistent font type. So I noticed that there's, in some cases, the size of them changes, so make sure that they're consistent. I think this whole section, right, this is the beginning of your results. This is still results. This is still results. This is still results. This is still results. This is results, and this is results. The point is, for your results, you're highlighting three key things, and that is I think the need for adequate funding for outreach, the importance of incorporating environmental NGOs or nonprofits into these outreach efforts, and then finally consistency in the in the way that we communicate risk, and that includes consistency across agencies. I think in order for you to really drive that point home, you should make sure, one, that you let your audience know either through a banner or through some consistent aspects of the title where they are in your presentation: intro, question, methods, and internship and methods, results, and significance. And then also, for instance, when you're talking about slides, like this slide, I believe, is really this is sort of like the first question: what is happening? What are the outreach efforts that are occurring right now? Right, I think that's answering your first question here. What risk communication methods are currently being used to implement site-related fish advisories? And this is in Region 10, right? So it's kind of specific. And then you mention what those things are. Because of limited funding, you've got basic signage and just published advisories in various locations. But but this has limited utility, right? That's the important point that you're trying to drive home. So now you're getting to the second part of your question, still in the results. So what do we need to do? The second question I think actually could be modified. So instead of how effective are these methods and how can they be improved, really it's what are the barriers to effective methods, right? Or or I should say, how maybe it is just simply how can these what can be done to improve uh, methods to reach the most at-risk populations, right? Just trying to clarify this because you're not really saying you're not really evaluating the effectiveness. I think for the most part of these methods, right? You didn't really look at sort of these signs out there in Region 10. You just looked at what's currently being done in Region 10, and now you're saying, how can they be improved, and and I think the way that you identified how they can be improved is by doing things like adequately funding communication efforts, right? So this is an example of adequately funding communication efforts. So that would be the first. If you wanted to, you could have a slide that essentially said, we can improve communication through three approaches. One, or three approaches, and those very clearly you can very concisely list them as adequately funding outreach, involving NGOs, and making sure and consistency among consistency in risk communication. Those are your three, right? Then you can go into details about those three. One, adequate funding. Here's an example from the Hudson River. So you talk about what they did in the Hudson River, and you can talk about all the various things that they did. I mean, they have 16 publications. They produced a game. They have maps. They have outreach events, and that's really helping to cast a wider net in communicating the risk. Then you go on to the role of the of nonprofits. Yeah, it looks like this picture is a little bit pixelated, but maybe you don't have one that's any clearer than that, so that might be what you're stuck with. So, here I think the idea is that you're showing this graphic, which I believe nonprofits play a pivotal role. Aspect associated with fishing, the nonprofit can act as a middleman in between. The nonprofits tend to play a pivotal role. I guess. Okay, so I think that this is slide 14, right? So looking at the Hudson River Advisory Program as an example, the role of the nonprofits here exceeds any other example of risk communication methods being implemented. Convenience survey conducted at fishing expos. So again, spreading out the outreach. That's what NGOs can do, and we can see that it's really helping to convey the information. With information like this, when you show a graphic, you're going to need to make sure that you give your audience a chance to look at the various the labels here so that they fully understand what's happening. You want to point to these things. This is the percentage across 3 surveys that were conducted. More than 50% of the people knew about it previously. And that it's really spreading out the average. I think that it's really important to highlight to your audience what the most important thing here is for them to look at. So, yes, I knew about it previously. No, to be quite honest, I'm not quite sure why the reason I hesitated there for a second. I'm not quite sure why there's a legend here. I don't know if you did that or somebody else did that. Personally speaking, thinking of like proper visual guidelines. This is just repeating the information down here. There's really no need for it. I don't know. That's just my own personal opinion. Maybe you can't change that. Um, but if I was going to create this graphic, I would not use a legend because this is completely unnecessary to understand what's happening here in this pattern. Again, this is part of your results, specifically focused on NGOs, results NGO involvement. And so I think if you had a title that indicated that was consistent and consistently placed on each one of the slides, it would help lead your audience through your presentation. Okay, then you're moving on to consistency. So results, and now we're into consistency. Talking about the difference in jurisdiction here, I think, let me go over what you said. Okay, this all looks good. The difference between the EPA and the FDA. And the fact that the FDA methodology really doesn't work when we're talking about these at-risk groups. And I think that's a very important point to make, that in terms of equity, in terms of really being inclusive within the guidelines, it really isn't built for subsistence fishers. So we need to be more consistent. I think that's a really good point to make. And now you're showing the data again. Because you're doing it in this way, just make sure that make sure that you give your audience time to look at the various axes and point out the really important pieces here, because you need to drive home to your audience that this is really a problem if we're not being consistent. If we're not being consistent in the way that these agencies are thinking about contaminant tolerance, then how can we communicate that risk to folks, particularly people who maybe are not necessarily speaking English as a first language or responding to the information that they're seeing. Oh, one thing I want to point out is, I'm not sure what's going on here, but when we go between these slides, there's this weird flash of material at the bottom of the screen, and I don't know what that is, but you might want to see if there's something hidden in your slides. You might need to copy and paste it in so you don't get that pop-up. So you see that at the bottom of the screen there. Looks like a little banner. All right, so moving on. So here's the thing. You really do need to have a significance section, or something that really highlights the importance of what you're talking about. Now, yes, it is really, we do want to promote that fish is nutritious and good for your health overall. But in thinking about this, thinking about the results that you just conveyed to the audience, about proper funding for outreach, dedicated funding for outreach rather, incorporating NGOs into communication efforts, and then consistency within that risk communication. Knowing that, what do you suggest happens? What do you think needs to happen? Well, I think that that when these fish advisories are occurring, there really does need to be a lot of thought put to risk communication, particularly to vulnerable groups, and that the approaches that you described need to be incorporated. So, I think that's a really important thing to point out. I think that this is also very important, not just for fish advisories, but for other issues of environmental concern, particularly issues of environmental justice. Um, so those are some other things that you might want to throw in here to really kind of think about the bigger picture, the broader scope. I think this is a good thing to leave people with. That fish, fish is good, it's nutritious, it's good for your health, and that we shouldn't, that we need to balance communicating risk of pollution with the advantages of eating fish. But I think that you should probably also bring in some of those other things, and certainly having a banner or something on here that indicates that you're talking about the significant section of your work is critical. Okay, and then acknowledgments. There's nothing on your acknowledgement slide. Be great. I mean, I don't know if that's because it's not coming through or what, but friends, family, loved ones, staff, faculty that you appreciate. I mean, there's lots of things that you can put on here, but um, I don't know if that's where you plan on leaving it, or if you want to move on to your reference section. Um, Obviously, what's going to end up happening is during your presentation, you will give your presentation. 10 minutes will be up, and there will be some slide left on the screen as we do our switch over to the next presentation. So you decide which slide you want that to be. Do you want that to be your acknowledgments, or do you want that to be this list of references? It's totally up to you. Just be aware that you have to plan for that. All right, that's my feedback for you. Let me know if you have any questions.